Hello everybody, it's Greg from ERFA here again for another online Renaissance fencing tutorial. And today we're going to cover two concepts which are very closely related in Grassi's late 16th century swordsmanship system, footwork and defence. So Grassi has this doctrine that all fencing comes from the feet. In other words, the footwork that you use is extremely important. I will cover footwork first and then explain how it relates to the use of the sword in defence second. So I'm going to put my sword down. Okay, I'm going to give a super quick summary of Grassi's footwork just to get going. So from the basic upright 16th century Italian posture, I'm going to demonstrate the two main footwork steps which Grassi uses. So they're basically divided into whole steps or full steps and half steps. Very simple. So a full step is defined as when your feet pass each other, like when you're walking. So that's one full step, that's two going forwards, that's 1, 2 going backwards. And a half step, surprisingly enough, is half of that. In practical terms, what that means is the feet gather together and then separate. Gather together and then separate. When we're fencing, the full steps or whole steps are really only used when you have to cover a lot of ground quickly, like you're trying to break measure and escape from the reach of your opponent's weapon, that sort of thing. When you're in the middle of an exchange with the opponent, the half steps are used a lot of the time. The next thing to bear in mind is that Grassi's system is a non-linear one, so it's not just about going forwards and backwards. A lot of the steps which are used are angulated or circular, so they're moving at roughly 45-degree angles, or they are circling around in order to pivot your body a little bit, like this. I'm going to insert a clip here which shows a close-up of my feet as I'm just walking around the room using these footwork steps, mostly half steps with a few full steps. I'm just going to leave you to look at that clip and think about how all these steps might fit together in order to maneuver around a 360-degree space. And that's it as far as footwork goes for today. Let's get on to the interesting sword-related part, defence. So Grassi's system is a very mobile one. He says the optimal defence with the sword combines a parry, which in his system is a little beating aside of the opponent's weapon with the edge of yours, usually the true edge. And that's combined together with a step which moves your body a little bit out of the road of wherever the attack's coming from. There are two parries, one to the inside line and one to the outside line, which are described in a lot of detail in his book. So the inside line parry, so if there's an attack coming here from low ward, I'm going to knock aside the opponent's blade with my sword, and I'm going to use a circular step with the back foot to pivot my body a little out the road. But these two movements are combined together through the body, so like with the attacks, we're using this torso rotation mechanic to power this defense. So it looks like this. Okay, so notice my shoulder, my torso are turning to beat aside the opponent's attack. And the outside line is the mirror opposite. So the attack's coming in here. I want to beat it that way. I want to step with my back foot in this direction using a slope step. And I want to power it with this torso rotation so it looks like this. So the idea is that this mobile defense will allow you to knock aside your opponent's attack and put you in an angulated position to make a quick riposte. The riposte being with a thrust as much as possible because we're using thrust-oriented sword, the rapier, but you can also riposte with a cut, which would look like. Okay, so the mechanics of the riposte are just the mechanics of the attacks, which I've covered in previous tutorials. So, how can we train this? Well, first of all, I recommend training it in a fairly dynamic way when you're on your own, and just practice doing this repetitively, one side and the other. Inside line defense, outside line defense. I'm just going to shuffle forwards very slightly, and then demonstrate a few. Parry, riposte, cover. Parry, riposte, recover. Parry, riposte, recover. Parry, riposte, recover. And you can make this as fast and as dynamic as you want. I recommend, for conditioning purposes, to do as many repetitions as it takes to work up a light sweat and give your arm a bit of a workout. But remember, the principal powering mechanic of this is the torso rotation left and right. So the arm guides the sword. It will be worked out, but don't rely only on this muscle to do the parry or the riposte. So the body powers and the arm guides. Okay, so that's the basics of parrying and riposting in the Grassi system. So it's a mobile system. You're basically looking to deflect and dodge and then strike your opponent with a quick, compact riposte. Now, those are the main parries described in the books, the perfect parries, if you like. But he does also acknowledge that sometimes it's necessary to withdraw the front foot in order to save yourself. So that would be a half step back, perhaps, accompanied by a parry. Similarly, the ideal riposte is a thrust, as described, a stoccata, perhaps, which, as we learned before, is made with an advance of the front foot. However, if circumstances require it, you can also make a thrust using the back foot. Okay? So perhaps if we parry by moving the front foot, we might riposte using the back foot. Or if we want to parry the other way, parry with the front foot and riposte with the back foot. So within the wider boundaries of the Grassi system, we can mix up the footwork and the parries and the thrusts and cuts used as ripostes to make something which is very adaptable and very dynamic. I'm going to put my sword down and take up the trusty old dagger instead, which is going to simulate my sword in this case. It's a little bit easier to use in this confined space. And I'm just going to go through a little training routine that I do sometimes, which is just to improvise with these movements. Parrying, riposting, recovering, parrying, riposting, recovering. And just doing it a bit freestyle, mixing up all the steps, mixing up the inside and outside parry, and mixing up the stoccata with whatever cuts I want to do as a riposte. Actually, I'm going to change that slightly and say the thrust parry, we'll just call it a thrust because it's technically not always a stoccata, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, so we'll start off with the easy ones. So parry, riposte, recover, parry, riposte, recover, parry, thrust, parry, thrust. Etc, etc. So basically you can make that as dynamic as you like, and I recommend that you do so. This fits in with some of the general training advice that Grassi gives in the back of his manual, where he includes a chapter on developing strength and conditioning for fencing. When you do this sort of exercise, the thing you should focus on primarily is fluid movements, tight control of the weapon, and making sure that this torso rotation mechanic is primarily what powers all of the weapon movements. Finally, it's worth underlining one of the key principles, the whole system, which is the foot is the strength and support of the hand. In other words, whenever the sword makes a movement, you must take a step with one of your feet in order to support the weight and the motion of the sword. So basically, as our body changes shape, for a parry, for example, one of our feet needs to slip around to support that new shape. And the same with the attacks. So, to summarise, to quote two of Grassi's doctrines, all fencing comes from the feet, and the foot is the strength and support of the hand. And on top of that, we can add the extra idea that the perfect defence is one that combines a parry and a step. Keep mobile and be non-linear. So, important principles to remember for your Grassi fencing training, and that's all for today. See you next time.